The biting wind tore through the dense Alaskan wilderness, its howls blending with the crunch of John's boots on the frozen ground. Each step forward seemed heavier than the last as snow fell in relentless waves, blanketing the landscape in icy desolation. John adjusted his backpack and rifle, his breath escaping in short, visible puffs against the freezing air. The forest stretched endlessly around him, the towering pines standing as silent sentinels, weighed down by layers of frost. He was used to this solitude, the harsh beauty of the Alaskan wild, but today something felt different. There was an odd stillness in the air, a quiet that sent a ripple of unease through his chest. He was on the trail of a deer. Tracks had led him this far, but they had vanished beneath the fresh snow that fell faster than he could follow. Frustrated, John paused, scanning the horizon. The distant mountains rose sharply, their peaks swallowed by gray clouds. As much as he hated returning to his cabin empty-handed, he knew the forest often had other plans. For all its beauty, it was a place of survival, where the line between life and death was often razor-thin. And then he heard it, a faint whimper carried by the wind. John froze, his body instinctively alert. His hand tightened on the rifle slung over his shoulder as he turned his head toward the sound. It came again, more distinct this time, cutting through the silence like a plaintive cry. He squinted into the trees, his hunter's instincts prickling. Was it an injured animal? Or something more dangerous, like a bear or a wolf? He took a cautious step forward, his boots sinking into the thick snow. The whimpering grew louder as he approached, now unmistakable in its tone. It wasn't a predator's growl or the warning of an animal defending its kill. It was a sound of pain, of desperation. John pushed through a cluster of low-hanging branches, his heartbeat quickening as the source came into view. There, half buried in the snow, lay a she-wolf. Her silver-gray coat was speckled with ice and dirt, her body heaving with shallow, labored breaths. John could see her ribs jutting out beneath her skin, a stark sign of starvation. But what struck him most was her swollen belly. She was pregnant. The wolf's amber eyes flickered weakly as she tried to lift her head, a feeble growl escaping her throat before she collapsed again, too exhausted to resist. John stared at her, a mix of fear and pity warring within him. She was a wild animal, a predator that could easily turn on him if she regained her strength. Logic told him to walk away, to let nature take its course. Yet something in her eyes stopped him. They weren't just the eyes of a wolf. They held a flicker of vulnerability, a silent plea for mercy. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, crouching slowly. His movements were deliberate, careful not to startle her further. "What the hell are you doing out here like this?" The wolf's ears twitched, but she didn't move. Her breathing was shallow, each rise and fall of her chest a battle. John reached into his backpack and pulled out a strip of dried venison. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. He tore off a piece and tossed it toward her, keeping a safe distance. The she-wolf's nose twitched, catching the scent of the meat. For a moment, she didn't move, her body trembling with the effort of staying conscious. Then, with a sudden burst of resolve, she dragged herself forward, her movements slow and deliberate. Her jaws snapped up the venison, and she swallowed it in one gulp, her eyes fixed on John with a wary intensity. "That's it," he murmured, his voice low and soothing. "You're not giving up yet, are you?" Over the next half hour, John fed her the rest of the venison, each piece disappearing faster than the last. He could see her strength returning, though she was still too weak to stand. The snow continued to fall, and John knew he couldn't leave her there. The cold would claim her by nightfall if starvation didn't finish the job first. But helping her wasn't without its risks. If her pack was nearby, they could easily see him as a threat. And even if she was alone, a pregnant wolf was unpredictable. Still, the thought of walking away felt wrong. He couldn't shake the image of her struggling to move, her belly heavy with the life she was fighting to protect. John worked quickly, gathering branches and tying them together with the tarp from his pack to form a crude sled. It wasn't pretty, but it would have to do. As he approached the wolf again, she let out a low growl, her teeth bared weakly. "Easy, girl," he said, holding up his hands. "I'm just trying to help you." Her growl faded, replaced by a heavy sigh, as if she had no energy left to argue. John wrapped her gently in the tarp, securing her to the sled. She didn't resist, her body limp with exhaustion. The trek back to his cabin was slow and arduous. The snow was deeper than he had anticipated, and the sled's weight dragged against him with every step. His muscles burned, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. When he finally reached his cabin, the sun was beginning to set, casting the snow-covered landscape in hues of gold and pink. John untied the sled and carried the she-wolf inside, laying her carefully on a worn rug near the fireplace. She didn't stir, her sides heaving as she fought to catch her breath. "All right," John said, his voice strained. "Let's get you warmed up." He lit a fire, the flames crackling to life and filling the cabin with much-needed warmth. The wolf's eyes opened slightly, her ears flicking as the heat reached her. John draped a blanket over her, unsure if it would help, but unwilling to leave her exposed to the cold any longer. "You need a name," he said after a moment, sitting cross-legged beside her. "Ziri. That's what I'll call you." The name felt right, though he couldn't explain why. Ziri didn't respond, but her ears twitched again, as if acknowledging his words. Over the next several days, John nursed her back to health. He melted snow for water, carefully feeding her small portions of fresh meat. Each day brought small victories, a wag of her tail, a stronger bark, a flicker of life returning to her eyes. Despite her wild nature, a bond began to form between them. Ziri would watch him with a mixture of caution and trust, her piercing amber gaze following his every move. She was still a wolf, still unpredictable, but there was an understanding between them now. They were both survivors, brought together by chance in the unforgiving wilderness. One evening, as the snowstorm raged outside, John sat by the fire, his hand resting lightly on Ziri's side. Her belly had grown larger, a reminder of the life she carried. He thought about the odds stacked against her, against both of them. Life in the Alaskan wilderness was never easy, but in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the steady sound of Ziri's breathing, John felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. "You got a fight ahead of you," he said softly, "but you're not alone. I've got your back." Ziri let out a low, contented growl, her eyes meeting his. And for the first time in what felt like forever, John allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could both find a way to survive. The howling storm outside was relentless, the wind battering the wooden cabin as if testing its resilience. Inside, however, the crackling fire provided a stark contrast, a small island of warmth in the frozen wilderness. John sat on the edge of his worn armchair, watching Ziri closely. She lay curled up on the thick rug near the hearth, her body trembling with visible discomfort. Her once gaunt frame had filled out slightly thanks to weeks of rest and consistent meals, but now her swollen belly, taut with life, was the center of John's concern. Something was happening. For days, he had been bracing for this moment. Ziri had grown more restless, pacing the cabin when she had the strength, occasionally letting out soft whines that tugged at John's chest. He had done his best to prepare, but what did a man know about aiding a wild wolf in labor? Every instinct told him to let nature take its course, but his bond with Ziri had deepened. She trusted him now, in her quiet, guarded way. He wasn't about to abandon her when she needed him most. "Come on, girl," John murmured, his voice low and steady. "You've made it this far. You can do this." Ziri let out a low growl, more a rumble of discomfort than aggression, and shifted her position on the rug. Her golden eyes flickered open for a moment, locking onto John. There was something almost pleading in her gaze, a rare crack in the strong, untamed demeanor she usually wore. It made John's stomach twist. He reached out slowly, his hand stopping a foot from her trembling body, unsure if she wanted comfort or space. As the minutes crawled by, the first contraction hit. Ziri let out a guttural sound, her body convulsing. John flinched, his heart hammering in his chest. He felt helpless, useless even, as the she-wolf fought against the pain. All he could do was keep the fire burning, keep the cabin warm and quiet, and hope that nature would guide her through. The hours passed in a tense blur. The storm outside raged louder, as if the wilderness itself were testing Ziri's strength. Every cry she made sent a pang through John's chest. He had heard wolves howl before, but these sounds were different, raw, vulnerable, and laced with an agony that made him grit his teeth. At one point, Ziri let out a sharp yelp and turned her head toward him, her eyes narrowing in frustration or desperation. John leaned closer, speaking softly. "You're not alone," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'm right here." Then it happened. The first pup came into the world with a sharp cry, its tiny body slick and wriggling against the rug. Ziri's breathing was ragged, her chest heaving as she instinctively turned to clean the newborn. John sat frozen, his hands gripping his knees as he watched. The pup's high-pitched squeals filled the cabin, a fragile sound of life fighting to begin. "Good girl, Ziri," John whispered, a mixture of awe and relief washing over him. "That's one." But the ordeal was far from over. Another contraction rippled through Ziri's body, her whine echoing off the cabin walls. A second pup followed, then a third, each one arriving with its own struggle and triumph. John's stomach clenched each time she cried out, his helplessness gnawing at him. He tried to stay out of her way, knowing she needed to do this on her own, but his hands itched to help, to do something. Finally, the fourth pup was born, its cry softer than the others. Ziri let out a low, guttural groan, collapsing onto her side. She looked utterly spent, her body trembling as she nudged the tiny creatures closer to her for warmth. John exhaled a shaky breath, wiping the sweat from his brow, even though he hadn't moved. "4 of them," he muttered, leaning back against the wall. "You're one tough girl, Ziri." The pups were impossibly small, their fur damp and clinging to their delicate frames. They squirmed blindly, their tiny noses seeking the warmth of their mother. Ziri, despite her exhaustion, began cleaning them methodically, her maternal instincts kicking in. The sight stirred something deep in John, a strange mixture of pride and protectiveness. He didn't just feel like an observer anymore. He was part of this in some way. But the tension wasn't over. As the hours passed, Ziri seemed weaker than he had expected. Her movements grew slower, her breath shallow. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up, and the cold seemed to creep closer, seeping through the wooden walls. John crouched near her, his eyes scanning the pups. They were alive and moving, but Ziri's condition worried him. "Hang in there," he said, his voice firm. "You didn't fight this hard to give up now." He worked quickly, stoking the fire until the cabin was almost unbearably warm. He brought over fresh water, setting the bowl within Ziri's reach. She barely stirred, her ears twitching weakly in acknowledgement. The pups huddled against her belly, their tiny bodies rising and falling with each shallow breath they took. John sat back on his heels, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if you can understand me, Ziri, but I'm going to take care of you. All of you." For the next few days, the cabin became a sanctuary of survival. Ziri's recovery was slow and fraught with moments of uncertainty. She refused to eat at first, her strength seemingly sapped by the ordeal. John resorted to hand-feeding her scraps of cooked venison, speaking to her in low, soothing tones as he coaxed her to take bite after bite. Each small victory felt monumental, a flick of her tail, the way her ears perked up slightly when he spoke her name. The pups grew stronger with each passing day, their soft fur fluffing out as they nursed. They began to make tiny sounds, yelps and whines that filled the cabin with life. John found himself smiling more often than he had in years, watching their clumsy movements as they began to explore the rug. One of them, the smallest of the litter, had a streak of silver running down its back that reminded him of Ziri. He started calling it Silver, a name that felt fitting. Despite the moments of joy, there were still challenges. Ziri's recovery was slow, and John often found himself doubting whether he was doing enough. On one particularly cold night, she began trembling violently, her breath coming in short gasps. Panic gripped him as he wrapped her in extra blankets, his hands shaking as he massaged warmth into her paws. "Don't do this," he whispered desperately. "You can't give up now." Hours later, as dawn broke and the storm began to ease, Ziri's breathing steadied. She opened her eyes, and for the first time, John saw a spark of the fierce determination that had drawn him to her in the first place. "You're a fighter," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "You always have been." Ziri and her pups were alive, but John knew the road ahead would be difficult. The wilderness didn't care about their fragile triumphs. Yet, as he sat by the fire, the pups curled up against their mother's side, he felt something he hadn't in years: purpose. They had survived the storm together, and for now, that was enough. The first time John saw the black wolf, it was nothing but a fleeting shadow on the edge of the forest. He had been outside chopping wood, the steady rhythm of his axe splitting through the silence, when he noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. At first, he thought it might be a moose or a bear, something large, blending into the grayness of the wilderness. But when he turned fully, he saw it, a massive wolf, its fur as black as midnight, standing just beyond the tree line. Its eyes burned amber, fixed on him with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. John froze, the axe hanging loosely in his hand. The wolf didn't move, its posture rigid and alert. It wasn't like Ziri, who had been weak and desperate when he found her. This creature radiated power and confidence, the kind of dominance that came from surviving countless winters in the harsh wilderness. John felt his stomach knot as the wolf's gaze flickered toward the cabin, where Ziri and her pups rested. "Damn it," John muttered under his breath. He wasn't sure what the wolf wanted, but the sheer size of the creature made his intentions clear. If it wanted something, it would take it. The wolf didn't advance, but it didn't leave either. It stood its ground, watching as if measuring John. Slowly, John lowered the axe, his heart pounding in his chest. "You don't want to come any closer," he said aloud, his voice steady but firm. "She's under my protection." The wolf's ears twitched, but it remained silent. After what felt like an eternity, it turned and disappeared into the trees, its massive frame vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. John exhaled shakily, his grip tightening on the axe. That night, he kept the fire roaring and stayed by the window, his rifle resting on the table beside him. Ziri seemed unaware of the encounter. Her pups nestled against her as they slept. But John couldn't shake the image of those burning amber eyes, the way the wolf had looked at him, as if deciding whether he was a threat or prey. Days passed, and the black wolf's presence became harder to ignore. At first, it was just small signs, a faint set of tracks in the snow near the cabin, a shadowy figure moving through the trees. Then, one morning, John woke to find fresh kills outside his door. A hare, neatly placed on the porch. The following day, a snowshoe rabbit. At first, John was confused. The forest didn't give gifts, and wolves certainly didn't hunt for humans. He began to suspect the black wolf was leaving these offerings, not for him, but for Ziri and her pups. The realization unsettled him. The wolf wasn't just watching them, it was staking a claim. Ziri, meanwhile, seemed to sense the black wolf's presence. She had grown stronger in recent weeks, her maternal instincts sharpening as she nursed and protected her pups. John noticed her growling softly at the door some nights, her ears pinned back as if warning the unseen predator to stay away. But she didn't seem entirely hostile. There was a strange familiarity in her body language, a tension mixed with recognition. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson, John spotted the black wolf again. It was closer this time, standing boldly in the open field near the cabin. Its fur glistened in the fading light, its massive frame dwarfing any wolf John had ever seen before. The creature was a predator in every sense of the word, but there was something else in its stance, something protective. John stepped outside cautiously, his rifle slung over his shoulder. The black wolf didn't move, its piercing eyes locked onto him. John felt the weight of that gaze, the way it seemed to strip him bare, assessing every inch of him. "You're not just passing through, are you?" John said, his voice low. "You're here for them." The wolf bared its teeth in a silent snarl, a warning that sent a shiver down John's spine. But it didn't attack. Instead, it lowered its head slightly, its ears flattening in a gesture that was more calculated than submissive. John realized, with a jolt, that the wolf wasn't trying to scare him. It was testing him. For the next hour, they stood in an uneasy standoff. John didn't dare move closer, and the wolf seemed content to keep its distance. Finally, as darkness fully enveloped the forest, the black wolf turned and loped away, its movements fluid and almost graceful. The tension between John and the black wolf continued to build in the days that followed. The wolf began appearing more frequently, circling the cabin at dusk or standing at the edge of the woods, its presence a constant reminder that John wasn't alone in his guardianship of Ziri and her pups. Ziri herself seemed less wary of the wolf as time went on. She no longer growled at the door or paced restlessly when it was near. Instead, she watched it with a quiet curiosity, her ears flicking in acknowledgement. John couldn't decide whether this was a good thing or a sign of danger. One night, as John sat by the fire, he heard a low, guttural growl from outside. It wasn't Ziri, it was deeper, more menacing. Grabbing his rifle, John stepped onto the porch, his breath fogging in the cold air. The black wolf stood at the edge of the clearing, its fur bristling as it stared into the darkness. John followed its gaze and saw them. Two other wolves, smaller but no less threatening, slinking toward the cabin. They were thin and ragged, their movements desperate. Rogue wolves, likely outcasts from their own pack, searching for an easy meal. The black wolf let out a warning bark, its posture shifting into a defensive stance. The rogues hesitated, snarling and snapping at each other. John raised his rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger, but he didn't fire. He didn't need to. The black wolf lunged forward, its growl erupting into a ferocious roar that echoed through the forest. The rogues scattered, their retreat quick and chaotic. The black wolf didn't chase them far, returning to the clearing with its head held high, its dominance clear. It turned toward John, its amber eyes gleaming in the firelight. For the first time, there was no hostility in its gaze. Instead, there was something almost like respect. John lowered his rifle slowly, his heart still pounding. "All right," he muttered. "I guess we're on the same side now." The black wolf huffed, a sound that was almost dismissive, and disappeared into the trees. But John knew it wouldn't go far. It had chosen its role, as Ziri's protector, as the guardian of the pups. And whether John liked it or not, they were allies now. As the days turned to weeks, the uneasy truce between man and wolf solidified. The black wolf continued to patrol the perimeter, keeping predators at bay. It still didn't trust John entirely, keeping its distance and growling if he got too close. But it no longer saw him as an enemy. In the quiet moments, when John watched the pups play under Ziri's watchful eye, he couldn't help but feel a strange gratitude toward the black wolf. They were an odd pack, thrown together by chance and necessity. But in the brutal wilderness, even the most unlikely alliances could mean the difference between life and death. The morning was unnervingly quiet, the kind of stillness that set John's nerves on edge. The snow lay untouched around the cabin, glittering in the pale light of dawn, and the cold air felt sharper than usual as it bit at his exposed skin. He had stepped out to fetch more firewood, but something felt off. Ziri was tense inside the cabin, her ears flicking toward the door as though she sensed the same unease. Even the black wolf, who normally circled the clearing at a confident distance, was nowhere to be seen. John shook his head, trying to shake off the creeping paranoia. He stacked the firewood in his arms and turned to head back inside when the sound of voices stopped him cold. "Tracks over here," a gruff voice called out. It was followed by the unmistakable crunch of boots on snow, heavy and deliberate. "Big ones. Looks like a damn bear." "Nah, it's wolves," another voice replied, closer this time. "Big pack too. Must have been hunting here for weeks. Look at these trails. Must be close." John felt his stomach knot. Hunters. He hadn't seen anyone out here in months, not since winter had blanketed the wilderness in isolation. Now, as the voices grew louder, he knew these men weren't just passing through. They were tracking, and from the sound of it, they were after Ziri and her family. Setting down the firewood carefully, John crouched low, his heart pounding in his chest. He crept toward the edge of the cabin, peering around the corner. There were 3 of them, burly men in thick winter gear, their rifles slung over their shoulders. They moved with purpose, their eyes scanning the forest floor for tracks. One of them knelt, brushing snow away from a fresh set of paw prints. "See that?" the first man said, tapping the tracks with the butt of his rifle. "Big enough to be an alpha. Probably one of those rogue packs." "Damn wolves," another muttered, adjusting his hat. "They've been killing deer left and right. We need to cull them before they get too comfortable." John's hands curled into fists. The idea of Ziri, her pups, or even the black wolf falling victim to these men made his blood boil. He had seen the other side of these creatures, their struggle, their resilience, their will to survive. They weren't the mindless killers these hunters imagined them to be. He stepped out from behind the cabin before he could second-guess himself. "Morning, fellas," he called out, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath it. The men froze, their heads snapping toward him. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind brushing through the trees. Then the first man straightened, narrowing his eyes at John. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, his tone sharp. His hand hovered near his rifle, more out of caution than outright aggression. "Name's John," he said, keeping his hands visible as he approached. "This is my property." The hunters exchanged glances, clearly sizing him up. The second man, a wiry fellow with a scruffy beard, snorted. "Didn't think anyone lived this far out," he said. "What are you doing out here?" "Same as you, I imagine. Surviving." John stopped a few feet away, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp. "I couldn't help overhearing." "You're tracking wolves?" "Damn right we are," the first man said, his voice hardening. "They've been tearing through the deer population. Found a carcass just a mile back, half-eaten, throat ripped out. These bastards don't kill clean. They hunt for sport." John bit back a retort, forcing himself to stay calm. "Wolves don't hunt for sport," he said evenly. "They hunt because they have to. Same as us." The wiry man scoffed. "Tell that to the ranchers losing livestock by the dozen, or the hikers getting chased off trails. You don't cull them, they get bold. Dangerous." John stepped closer, his jaw tightening. "There's no livestock out here. No hikers either. These wolves are just trying to survive, same as everything else in this wilderness." The third man, who had been silent until now, spoke up. He was younger than the others, his face half hidden beneath a thick scarf. "We saw tracks leading toward your cabin," he said, his voice cautious. "You sure you're not harboring them?" John's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. "Harboring wolves?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "Do I look insane to you? Wolves don't exactly make good house pets." The first man smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Maybe not, but if they're on your land, you'd do well to let us deal with them." "They're a threat." "They're not a threat," John snapped, his patience thinning. "You're more of a threat to them than they'll ever be to you." The hunters bristled at his tone, their postures stiffening. John saw their hands tighten on their rifles, and for a brief moment, he wondered if he'd pushed too far. But he couldn't back down now, not when Ziri and her pups were at risk. "Look," he said, forcing himself to sound calm. "I've lived out here for years. I know these wolves. They're not bothering anyone. They're keeping to themselves, hunting what they need. Killing them won't solve anything. It'll just unbalance the ecosystem." "Ecosystem?" the wiry man scoffed. "Spare us the lecture. You're telling me you'd rather let those beasts run wild than protect what's left of the game out here?" John stepped forward, his voice rising. "I'm telling you that wiping out a pack of wolves because you're scared of competition is cowardly. If you can't coexist with the wild, you shouldn't be out here." The first man's face darkened, and for a tense moment, John thought the situation might spiral out of control. But then the younger hunter spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "What if he's right?" he said, glancing at the others. "If the wolves aren't causing trouble, maybe we should leave them alone." The wiry man scowled. "You're soft, that's your problem." Enough, the first man growled, silencing the argument. He turned to John, his expression unreadable. You're real protective of these wolves, aren't you? John held his ground. They've done nothing wrong. Killing them would be pointless. The man studied him for a long moment, then finally sighed. Fine, but if we hear about trouble from this pack, dead livestock, attack hikers, we'll be back. And we won't be asking permission. With that, he turned and stalked away, the others following reluctantly. John watched them go, his muscles coiled with tension until their voices faded into the distance. When he returned to the cabin, Ziri was waiting by the door, her ears perked and her eyes wary. John crouched beside her, running a hand gently along her side. They're gone, he murmured. You're safe. For now. But as he sat by the fire that night, listening to the distant howls of wolves in the wilderness, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that it wasn't over. The hunters would be back eventually. And when they came, John knew he would have to fight harder than ever to protect the fragile family he had come to care for. The snow was beginning to melt, revealing patches of brown earth beneath the soft white blanket that had dominated the landscape for months. Spring was creeping into the Alaskan wilderness, quiet but insistent, like a visitor too polite to announce themselves. The air smelled different now, cleaner, fresher, with the faintest hint of pine carried on the wind. For most, the arrival of spring brought relief, a break from winter's harsh grip. But for John, it carried with it an ache he wasn't sure he could bear. He sat on the porch, his elbows resting on his knees as he watched Ziri play with her pups in the clearing. They were no longer the fragile, helpless creatures he had first seen squirming on the rug by the fire. Over the weeks, they had grown into energetic bundles of fur, darting around with awkward enthusiasm as they tested their strength and balance. Their coats had thickened, shining in the sunlight as they wrestled and tumbled in the thawing snow. Ziri was a picture of health now, her sleek silver-gray fur gleaming as she kept a watchful eye on her pups. She had regained the proud, wild demeanor that had first struck John when he found her. She was no longer the desperate creature he had rescued from the cold. She was strong again, and the wilderness was calling her back. John's chest tightened at the thought. He had known this day would come eventually, had prepared himself for it, or so he thought. Ziri didn't belong here, not really. She was a creature of the wild, and so were her pups. They couldn't stay confined to the cabin forever. They needed to roam, to hunt, to live as wolves were meant to live. But knowing that didn't make it any easier. The black wolf, as if sensing the shift, had been appearing more frequently in recent days. It lingered at the edge of the clearing, its massive frame casting a shadow over the budding grass. Though it still kept its distance from John, its demeanor toward Ziri and her pups had changed. It wasn't just a protector anymore, it was a guide, a figure of authority. John understood the unspoken message in the black wolf's presence. It was time. That evening, John sat by the fire, the cabin filled with a quiet that felt heavier than usual. Ziri lay near the hearth, her pups curled up against her side in a tangle of fur and tiny paws. The sight made John's throat tighten. He had grown used to their presence, the soft whimpers, the playful yelps, the way they tumbled over each other in clumsy joy. The cabin, once a place of solitude, now felt alive because of them. And soon, it would feel empty again. You know you have to go, John said quietly, his eyes fixed on the flames. Ziri's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but she didn't move. It's where you belong. Out there, not here. She lifted her head, her golden eyes meeting his. There was something in her gaze that made him pause. It wasn't defiance or resistance. It was understanding. She knew. Of course, she knew. John let out a heavy sigh, rubbing a hand over his face. You've got a whole world waiting for you, he said, his voice hoarse. And those pups, they need to learn how to survive. I can't give them what they need. Ziri rested her head on her paws, her eyes never leaving him. For a moment, the silence between them felt almost unbearable. Then, as if to break it, one of the pups let out a tiny yawn and nuzzled closer to her. John smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. The next morning, John stood at the edge of the clearing, watching as the sun rose over the distant mountains. The air was crisp, but no longer biting, the promise of warmth lingering just beneath the surface. Ziri and her pups stood near the tree-line, their figures silhouetted against the soft glow of dawn. The black wolf was there too, its imposing presence a reminder of the wild world they were returning to. John's heart felt like it was being pulled in two directions. Every fiber of his being wanted to call them back, to keep them close, to protect them. But he knew that wasn't fair, to them or to himself. Wolves weren't meant to be caged, no matter how safe the cage might be. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to take a step forward. "Ziri," he called out, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. She turned to look at him, her ears perked. The pups hesitated, their tiny bodies pressed against hers, as if unsure of what to do. "You've got this," John said, his hands clenched at his sides. "You're ready?" For a moment, Ziri didn't move. Then, slowly, she stepped forward, her nose brushing against his hand in what felt like a goodbye. John froze, his breath catching as he felt the warmth of her touch. It was brief, just a second or two, but it carried more meaning than words ever could. And then she was gone. Ziri turned and bounded into the trees, her pups following close behind. The black wolf lingered for a moment, its amber eyes fixed on John. There was no hostility in its gaze this time, only acknowledgement. And then it too disappeared, its dark form melting into the shadows of the forest. John stood there long after they were gone, the clearing empty and silent once more. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, a mix of pride and sorrow swirling in his chest. He had done the right thing, he knew that, but knowing didn't make it hurt any less. The days that followed were quiet, too quiet. The cabin, once filled with the sounds of life, now felt hollow. John went through his routine, chopping wood, tending the fire, hunting, but it all felt mechanical, as if the heart had been ripped out of it. He found himself glancing at the rug by the hearth, half expecting to see Ziri curled up there, her pups tumbling over each other in a playful heap. But the rug was empty, and the silence was deafening. One afternoon, while gathering firewood, John spotted a set of tracks near the edge of the clearing. They were faint, almost erased by the thawing snow, but he recognized them immediately. Wolf tracks. His chest tightened, a flicker of hope sparking to life. He followed them to the edge of the forest, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the wilderness. Still, the tracks brought him a strange sense of comfort. They were a reminder that Ziri and her family were out there, alive and thriving. They were doing what wolves were meant to do, roaming, hunting, surviving. And maybe, just maybe, they hadn't forgotten him. As the weeks passed, John found himself slowly adjusting to the solitude again. It wasn't easy, but it was familiar. The wilderness had always been his home, and now it was Ziri's too. He couldn't begrudge her that. If anything, he felt a quiet pride in knowing he had played a small part in her survival. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, John sat on the porch, a mug of coffee warming his hands. He stared out at the forest, the shadows deepening as night fell. In the distance, a lone howl echoed through the trees, long and mournful. It was followed by another, then another, until the air was filled with the haunting melody of a wolf pack. John smiled faintly, his chest aching in a way that was both painful and bittersweet. "Good luck out there," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. And for the first time in weeks, the silence didn't feel so heavy. The seasons had turned once again. Winter's icy grip had long faded, replaced by the fleeting warmth of spring, then the golden glow of summer, and finally the fiery hues of fall. Now, the snow was returning, blanketing the Alaskan wilderness in its familiar shroud of white. For John, it marked a full year since Ziri and her pups had left. In that time, he had returned to his quiet routines, though the emptiness in the cabin still lingered. There were no playful yelps by the fire, no amber eyes watching his every move. He had thought often of Ziri and her pups, wondering if they had survived the perils of the wild. He told himself they had. They were strong. He had seen it himself. Yet doubt crept in, especially during the long, Lonely nights when the forest outside was silent. It had been weeks since he had last heard a wolf howl. Even the black wolf, who had once been a near-constant presence, seemed to have vanished. John tried not to think about it too much, though the absence gnawed at him. The first sign of their return came on a cold, gray morning. John was outside chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of his axe breaking the stillness. He paused to catch his breath, wiping sweat from his brow, when he felt it, a prickle of awareness at the back of his neck. He straightened, scanning the tree line. At first he saw nothing. The forest was quiet, the snow untouched. But then there was movement, a dark shape slipping between the trees. His heart leapt into his throat. It was massive, its silhouette unmistakable. The black wolf. John froze, the axe hanging limply in his hand as the wolf stepped into the clearing. Its coat was just as dark and glossy as he remembered, its amber eyes sharp and focused. It stood tall and proud, radiating an air of command. For a moment, they stared at each other, neither moving. Then, the black wolf tilted its head back and let out a long, low howl. The sound echoed through the clearing, and John's breath caught as more shapes emerged from the trees. Ziri was the first, her silver-gray coat gleaming against the snow. She moved with the fluid grace of a creature fully restored to her wild glory. Behind her, 4 wolves followed, her pups now grown. They were sleek and strong, their bodies lean with muscle and their movements confident. Yet John recognized them instantly. One had a streak of silver down its back. Silver, the smallest pup, now larger and more assured than John ever could have imagined. Ziri stopped a few feet from him, her golden eyes meeting his. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then she stepped forward, closing the distance between them. John dropped the axe, his hands trembling slightly as she came to a stop in front of him. She tilted her head, her nose brushing his hand in a gesture so familiar it made his throat tighten. "You made it," John whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're alive?" Ziri let out a soft whine, her eyes warm and unguarded. Behind her, the pups watched intently, their ears perked. The black wolf lingered at the edge of the clearing, its gaze sweeping over the scene like a silent sentinel. The reunion was bittersweet. For hours, John sat on the porch, watching the wolves as they explored the clearing. The pups, no, they weren't pups anymore, moved with a confidence born of a year in the wild. Yet there was still a playful curiosity to their movements as they sniffed at the cabin, the firewood, even John himself. Silver lingered the longest, its nose brushing against John's knee before bounding back to its siblings. Ziri stayed close to him, her presence calm and steady. It was as if no time had passed at all, as if they had never been apart. But John knew better. She was different now, stronger, freer, more wolf than the vulnerable creature he had found in the snow. And yet, in her eyes, there was still that flicker of recognition, that connection they had shared. The black wolf remained on the periphery, its piercing gaze watching every interaction. It didn't approach John, but it didn't interfere either. It was as if it had accepted him, acknowledged his role in Ziri's survival, and, by extension, the survival of the pack. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, John found himself sitting by the fire inside, the cabin door left open to the clearing. Ziri stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the fading light. She looked back at him, her eyes soft but resolute. She stepped inside, just for a moment, her nose brushing against his hand one last time before she turned and walked away. It wasn't goodbye. Not really. But John knew this was her way of telling him that she couldn't stay. The wild was her home, and it always would be. That night, John sat on the porch, the fire inside casting a warm glow behind him. The wolves remained in the clearing, their howls echoing through the forest as the stars began to appear overhead. He watched them, a bittersweet ache settling in his chest. They were no longer the fragile family he had nursed back to health. They were a pack now, strong and united, led by Ziri and the black wolf. As the hours passed, one by one, the wolves slipped back into the trees. Ziri was the last to go, her gaze lingering on John as if to say everything she couldn't. And then she was gone, her silver-gray form disappearing into the shadows. John stayed on the porch long after they had gone, the cold air biting at his skin. He didn't feel it. All he felt was the quiet pride swelling in his chest. They had come back, not because they needed him, but because they had chosen to. It was their way of showing gratitude, of honoring the bond they had shared. In the weeks that followed, John found himself thinking of them often. He would glance at the edge of the clearing, half expecting to see a flash of silver or black in the trees. Sometimes, late at night, he would hear a distant howl and wonder if it was Ziri or one of her pups. The cabin was quiet again, but it no longer felt empty. The memories of Ziri and her family filled the space, a constant reminder of the connection they had shared. It was a bond he hadn't expected, one he knew he might never experience again. But it was enough. As winter settled in once more, John sat by the fire, staring at the fading flames. A faint smile tugged at his lips as he thought of Ziri and her pups, somewhere out there in the vast wilderness, thriving. "Good luck out there," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. And for the first time in a long while, the silence felt comforting. He knew they would be okay.